Historic Boston Incorporated is taking on more projects to advance the city's preservation and sense of place in the future. To bring us up to date on what's happening with the Old Corner bookstore, an abandoned comfort station near Upham's Corner, and a historic church in Roxbury is the Executive Director of Historic Boston, Inc., Kathy Kottaridis. Thank you very much for being with us, Kathy.
Great, thank you.
I want to start with the Old Corner bookstore. People walk by it on the Freedom Trail all the time, but how did this building start out, actually?
It was built in 1718 by a private citizen for his home, if you can imagine Boston at that scale at the time, and he had an apothecary shop on the first floor, which would have been essentially a pharmacy of the time, and he lived upstairs. So it was a residence for the better part of 100 years.
Now, if this were a world where the only thing that happened was determined by the invisible hand of the free market, what would happen to that building, you think, given where it's located?
Presently, it would be a parking garage. Because in 1960 it was scheduled for demolition for a parking garage, which ultimately became the Pie Alley parking garage, a door down. But that was supposed to come all the way to the corner, and that was going to be part of the advancement of Boston in the 1960s. But a group of citizens got together and founded Historic Boston Incorporated, the organization we are today, to save the ancient buildings of Boston, and purchased the building and repositioned it on the belief that historic buildings could continue to survive and contribute back to Boston now and in the future.
Well, Historic Boston, doesn't just promote preservation. You buy property and you think of how to make it work. So, well, what's the plan here?
So for the Old Corner?
Yes.
The Old Corner bookstore continues to be what essentially it's always been. While there was once a residence in it, for the most part it's always had a commercial function and been part of the hub of downtown Boston. So we will continue to do what we've always done with that building, which is to make sure that it is a building that meets contemporary standards, that meets contemporary tenant needs, and ultimately provides commercial services of some sort or another. And we know those change over time to Boston and to the greater market.
Turning to a very different project in a different part of Boston, there is this old white clapboard church in Roxbury, St. James African Orthodox Church.
Yep.
And there's a history there. I wasn't even aware of this until this came up on your radar screen.
I'm not sure I was either, and we had not. It's a lovely building, and it's architect design, 1910, frame structure, again, of the scale that Highland Park really already has, and was really very neighborhood serving. But it was not really on our radar screen until it was threatened, and ultimately HBI intervened to acquire it, and we have plans for both the preservation of the building and reactivation of it for something else, not as a church, or not likely as a church, at least at this point. However, historically it was built by a group of Norwegian immigrants to serve other Norwegian immigrants of a evangelical church in that neighborhood, and people who were passing through, and naturally the demographics changed in the neighborhood. So by 1955, a group of African Americans, mostly originating in the Caribbean, purchased the church from the Norwegians and put it into use as the St. James African Orthodox Church, which was a denomination associated with the Marcus Garvey movement and the Back to Africa movement, and much more of the self-determination philosophy of Marcus Garvey. And so that group worshiped there right up until about 3 years ago when they sold it. The remaining members were much too old and ultimately looked to get it to somebody else to use as a church, but that did not work. So a developer purchased it with the idea that they could build more densely on the site, and that obviously hasn't worked out.
Well, I'm sure maybe the main reason Historic Boston, Inc. Became aware of this was that people in the neighborhood were concerned about what the market was planning. And tell us about that.
Yes, there had been multiple plans brought forward by a private developer to build 30 units initially of housing, and then down to 9 or 10, and a questionable use for the church, or an unknown use for the church, which disturbed the neighborhood quite a bit. I actually think that the neighborhood deserves a lot of credit here. It's a great example of their mobilization to make something happen that the market was not likely to do all by itself. So they petitioned the Landmarks Commission with something like 2,700 signatures from people in the neighborhood to make this a Boston landmark based on its mostly 20th century history. And ultimately, we're able to deter the developer or encourage the developer effectively to sell and to think about a different strategy.
Was this about a neighborhood concerned primarily about quality of life and density and parking, or is this more about the historic vitality of that church in the neighborhood in Roxbury?
I think it's a mix of all of those things. The Highland Park neighborhood has seen a lot of development pressure for which the neighborhood zoning and neighborhoods planning and even protections that places like Beacon Hill and Back Bay have were essentially not ready for. So we're in a time where the developers are recognizing the special nature of the neighborhood, that it's a wonderful place to live, but there are opportunities to scale up or think about expanding the value in the neighborhood. And the neighbors have begun to see the pressures and recognize that it's changing their neighborhood, changing it demographically, but changing it physically as well. So that this was really an effort to put a stake in the ground and say, no, these things should not happen without some proper planning and some processing in a planning sense before we talk about what kind of development actually happens. So good for them. I mean, that was really promising. So I think it's a mix of both the preservation and interest in the history of the neighborhood, but that is really the character that the neighborhood wishes to preserve for the future and to set the stage for any new development.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Kathy Kottaridis from Historic Boston, Inc. Kathy, turning to a very different kind of structure, not as spectacular. In Upham's Corner, there is a sort of a nondescript, boxy-looking thing. I didn't know it was. I went by it for years. It turns out it was sort of basically a public lavatory. And what's going to happen to that?
Well, the Upham's Corner Comfort Station is in construction now. In fact, if you go by, you won't see anything because there's a huge barrier around it right now. HBI worked with the City of Boston to acquire that and ultimately put together a project in which we will redevelop the building, restore it effectively, and place or get it ready for a market tenant, a young man from the neighborhood, Noah Hicks Deamore, who has put together a business plan for a coffee shop and a bike repair shop. So that will be the new use for that building. So, and it's right on Columbia Road. So what was kind of an anonymous building because it was in pretty bad shape for many years will now be an absolutely beautiful building that will continue to represent the civic nature of what it was doing back in the day where it supported the streetcar system. But will today be open to the public, or will it come spring be open to the public for coffee and bicycle repair and a stopover for people riding their bikes down Columbia Road?
And of course, it's right next to one of the oldest cemeteries in Boston.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the other advantage. When we plan our projects at Historic Boston, we not only think about the ultimate use and the money and all of that, we are also planning to make the cemetery more accessible by interpreting it and offering interpretive materials from the coffee shop as well, and helping the Parks Department to the extent that this is necessary to open it occasionally for the public to see on a more frequent basis.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Sure. Thank you.
Kathy Kottaridis from Historic Boston Incorporated.